Growing up playing video games and watching war movies, I didn't think twice about joining the Marines so I could be in the infantry. I went through all of the training and unwelcome hardship that makes you really reconsider your decision too. Anyway, I got stationed to a desert base known as 29 Palms, the largest piece of military-controlled land in the US. It covers approximately 932 square miles in total, I think. It's fucking huge, no matter how you look at it, in Southern California and a few hours from Mexico. When you're out there, you start to see some shit. So, fast forward to my first field op with me losing my shit. To put things into perspective as to how far away we are from civilization, the closest man-made object is a 3-hour ride away. This day was particularly hot too because it broke 130, as if the sun said, "I told you I could." So, we just spent all day hiding under camouflage netting getting classes about various military tactics. Well, once the sun set, we set off into the night to get some hard realistic training done. At night, we practice using our night vision optics to do some simple shit like reloading and reading maps and whatnot. It produces an image off of an ambient infrared light, so you can actually see a lot more shit than the naked eye. But the sky is absolutely cluttered with stars, and I can see a shooting star every few seconds, in fact. The Milky Way, it's pretty darn cool. But finally, after roaming around aimlessly for what felt like forever, we head back and we're granted a few hours for sleep. I lay down and I start to drift off. I'm suddenly woken up after what felt like 10 minutes, and I get up instantly. "Get up, bitch! You're on watch!" Ah, shit. I get dressed and I stand my post dutifully like I'm told to at checkpoint. I'm given a radio and told to only lift the barbed wire after it gets approved over the radio. It's maybe around 2 a.m. and everyone else in my company is dead asleep except for myself and an officer in the comm truck. All I can hear are the coyotes, and I decide to start looking at the stars with my night vision. I hear a coyote yelp off in the distance and think nothing of it. A few minutes later, another Marine comes over a small hill in front of me. But nothing crazy. I mean, he's probably just taking a dump or something. He walks toward me, but his eyes don't really reflect light. Rationally, one of us is probably dehydrated, so I don't think too much of it. He approaches me, and after a few seconds of staring at me, he simply says, "Can I come in?" His voice, it didn't sound right, but there was no inflection or questioning tone. Weird. I ask him what his name was and why he was out so far just taking a dump. He tells me his name is Sergeant Wright, and he ignores my dump question. Same weird voice. Granted, I'm new to the unit, so I don't know anyone named Sergeant White, but I still had to verify it. Main, this is Road Guard 1. There's a Sergeant Wright requesting entry. Over. Road Guard 1, this is Main. There is no Sergeant Wright in this company, and the closest unit is 25 miles away. Make sure... Shit. Just get the fuck back here right now, okay? Don't let him, or don't even look at him, okay? Just run. As the weird dude started to hear this, his face changed to severely angry, like he wanted to rip my throat out and drink my blood. By the time I got back, everyone is awake. All of the vehicle lights are turned on and everyone is packing up. Everyone was just scrambling into the trucks. We have a lot of shit left behind too, like the tents, water and food, and we drive the entire 3 hours back. I never got an explanation from anyone about this, but my squad leader, who was a simple backwoods kind of guy, who just said bluntly that whatever I saw wasn't asking to get through the gate. I never really understood what he meant until I came to this place. So after my most recent creepy experience with weird-looking people scaring the shit out of me, we went somewhere much more terrifying. A remote little Marine Corps base called Bridgeport. It's in a national forest just north of Yosemite. It was built to train Marines in the art of mountain warfare. There's a lot of mountains, and it's cold, basically. It's windy, and if you ever go there, you'll hate your life too. Anyway, when we first get there, we stay in these creepy concrete huts with bunk beds in them. There's a bathroom and some showers, and that's about it. You fight over the outlets to charge your electronics, and there's not really any heat besides a bunch of Marines cramped into one area. The first few days are miserable. Your body has to adjust to the new altitude, the air has less oxygen, so physical work and exercise plays out in slow motion. Oh, and you're constantly tired, and all you want to do is sleep. There isn't much in terms of fresh food too, and things can get pretty bleak if you have the wrong mindset. You wouldn't believe me if I told you that these were the better times, huh? Eventually, we march up into the mountains carrying our ridiculously heavy packs, stuffed to the brim with warming layers, food, water, and nicotine. The first few days were pretty easy, in fact. We would hike all day and stop to rest and learn a few things on survival and such. There was some snow on the lower parts, but not a ton, thankfully. Around the fourth night, someone had the awesome idea of making us practice our nighttime navigation skills. Now, I'm a pretty decent navigator myself, so I was up for the challenge, but no big deal. They hand out the compasses, maps, and protractors and set out an elaborate system of how to get to the finish line. It was staggered so that people weren't walking all over each other. And this is where things get interesting. So, I'm in the woods, it's dark and cold, and I hate my life, so I'm stumbling through the trees and the bush loud as hell without a care in the world. I just want to finish this dumb thing so that I can finally get some sleep. I get to my first point easily because there's some moonlight shining through the trees. The second one, though, was placed in a fucking river, and I still remember how livid I was standing in the river, copying down the word donkey etched into an emocan on the top of a rock in a freezing fucking cold river. Wet boots, man. I swear they drive a man insane. I stop to squeeze out the moisture from my socks, and I get this primal feel that I'm being watched all of a sudden. I stand completely still, and all I can hear is my heart beating. No wind or wildlife, just me. My first thought is that it's a Marine trying to piggyback off of my success. So I put my soggy boots back on and do what anyone would do. I crest the hill and stop so that I could listen. There's nothing, though. Maybe I'm just freaking the fuck out. Screw this. I keep walking. 10 minutes later, and I get that same feeling, though. Any rookie stalker knows that you have to match the person's steps so that they don't hear you. So I start to randomly stop or change my step. After a few wholehearted tries, I don't hear any steps, but I do hear breathing. If it's a mountain lion or something crazy like that, I have no choice but to keep walking and just hope that I can pull my dull Gerber knife out in time. About this time, I get to my third point and plot my final point. It's near a road, so I cut straight east and literally book it up the road. I still felt like I was being followed the entire time, mind you, but I felt safer because I could hear the low roar of a Humvee engine up the road. Looking back, I lead whatever it was right to the rest of us, and that was actually a pretty big mistake. Nothing else happens that night, and everyone else just gives up and just uses the roads to make it to camp. Those who don't make it back are told to walk towards the sound of a beeping horn. I finally get to sleep in the safety of numbers, and we use the next day to remediate our nighttime land nav skills and refuel our bodies with food. Once the sun sets, we march off into the mountains in a file. Unfortunately, though, since I carry a rocket launcher, my natural position is in the back, but not the very last, so that's positive at least. We spend the early night hiking, and we were moving very fast and at probably 20 meters paced apart. At times, it was common to lose sight of each other, in fact, and all of us were slowly getting exhausted. And suddenly, shit just gets dark. Like, the ambient light is just being absorbed. But I get that same primal fear again. Extreme silence? Yeah. I keep walking without a word until I hear someone, probably the guy behind me, call my name, and I turn around and he looks at me like I'm an idiot. What the fuck, man? Keep going, dude. They're gonna lose us. Okay. Weird. Who called my name then? I spin back around and try to see my way through the brush for the guy in front of me. I get a glimpse of him and discreetly yell at him to slow down, but he doesn't even hear me. About the same time, I hear from behind me, "Dude, what the fuck is..." I heard a light rustling of leaves and some twigs, but that's it. But I run back maybe 15 meters, which isn't far, but at night, that's quite a long distance. And there's nothing but his pack on the ground and his rifle. I call out his name, but there's nothing. I reach for my radio and it's dead. I turn on both of my flashlights and they're both dead. Fuck. I blow my whistle that they had made me pack, but there was nothing from that too. I don't know how long it took them to realize that I was missing and how they backtracked their way to me, but it felt like hours. I could feel whatever it was just out there waiting too, just fucking toying with me. I told them everything and they were convinced that the guy was just lost. They all spread out and looked for him for a few hours, but ultimately they just came up with nothing. Sometime the next morning, though, one of the hippie park volunteers found him about 30 kilometers away, across multiple mountains. He was bleeding from his ears and didn't even know his name. Of course, he was in extreme hypothermia and he had a ton of bruises on him, but no severe bleeding, mind you. They ended up getting a helicopter to take him to the closest hospital, and that was about it. Following the mysterious incident, I was told that I was going to be sent down the mountain to answer a few questions. But to be honest, I was relieved. It was cold and I didn't want to hike anymore. Everyone else in my company just sort of believed what they were told too. He came down with mountain sickness and just walked 30 kilometers over the course of a few hours. I tried to tell a few people about all the creepy shit that I'd been noticing, just to make sure I'm not going crazy. Before anyone could respond, though, my squad leader pulled me aside and told me, "Don't talk about these things, okay?" Maybe he knew something that I didn't, but yeah, cool. They sent us up here, knowing that something was fucking off. A typical military bullshit. Just stick our heads in the sand and pretend everything is great. I was glad that I was leaving for a few days, but there was nothing but complete dread whenever the idea of coming back entered my mind. The Humvee to take me back down finally showed up, and the ride was uneventful. They took me to a small concrete office-like building. The military police guys were just like me and had a job to do. They got a statement and asked if I noticed anything about the guy that was unusual before he disappeared. And no, he seemed normal to me. But then the NCIS guys came in, and I've dealt with them before over something else, and they're usually good-natured guys, but not these ones. They were brisk, to the point, and methodical. They read all of the facts about the case like they were reading the nutrition info on a cereal box or something. They were just completely unsurprised and monotone, if that's the right word. They'd definitely seen this before. They asked the same questions too, and when I had told them about all the creepy things I'd noticed, they told me that I was probably suffering from mountain sickness too. But to be honest, I was beyond pissed at this point, but I knew better than to argue with them. Another thing too, they asked me if I had taken any pictures that day, and I told them I didn't, but I thought that was strange. And next, they asked if they could swab my boots. To this day, I am honestly confused as to why the hell they did that. I don't know if they were fucking with me or if it was a part of something else, but my only assumption is that this thing alters the surrounding area on a microscopic level or something. Maybe there was an isotope it produces that may have stayed on my boots or something. I have no clue, but If anyone has similar stories or information on why they did that, please let me know, hey. At the conclusion of my interview, they made me sign a document stating that I wouldn't talk about anything and that they would contact me when I was free to disclose any information. This was a few years ago, mind you, and they just never got back to me. So, it may not be legal to talk now, but I have a few cards up my sleeve that I'm going to talk about anyway. So, I walked back to our fabulous 5-star concrete huts to get some sleep. Thankfully, I wasn't alone, as there were a few guys that stayed back because they had sickle cell anemia and could actually die if they went above a certain altitude. I took one of the best hot showers that I've ever had in my life, and I just headed to my bunk. I was exhausted, but I still couldn't sleep. Now, I rarely smoke, but I still carry a pack on me just to make lucrative trades or to sell to desperate nicotine friends in the field and whatnot. I felt like now was a good time to smoke, so I went outside. Maybe it would calm me down, is what I was thinking. And all was going well until that dreadful feeling came back again. Shit. The tree line was maybe 40 meters away. I don't know how the hell it followed me or why. Could there be more than one? Whatever the case, I stomped out my cigarette and just went back inside. I managed to calm myself down and eventually fall asleep, but I would always wake up suddenly after about 10 minutes. No dreams, just the overwhelming feeling that you're being observed, if you get my drift. The next day, I packed all my gear into the Humvee and helped the driver load some stuff into the back. The drive was uneventful again, and I managed to catch some sleep, even if only to be woken up by rough terrain here and there. When we finally arrived, it was almost afternoon and the company was preparing to cover some serious terrain that day. Just my luck, right? Before I knew it, we were trotting up a steep mountainside. I didn't think it could get any worse until it began to sleet heavily, and it was bad. But the wind picked up and it felt like we were being cut by glass. I couldn't see and people were getting lost and the rocks were slippery too. We hiked for just hours upon hours, and I swear these mountains were just trying to kill us. The sun began to set, and our clothes began to freeze on us too. And if that wasn't bad enough, I'd noticed that our compass, it was acting weird. No matter how hard you tried, you would eventually end up walking towards the base of a particular mountain that was nicknamed Devil's Incline on our map. This was a military map that someone had made in the 1980s, mind you. I don't know if I'll be able to find it again, but coincidentally, I also got that same feeling of being stalked again. Anyway, our guides get us to the right destination, a place called Sardine Rock. As soon as we stop, people start shaking violently because they're no longer hiking and producing zero body heat. Someone was smart enough to predict this and had 2 man tents driven up to our rendezvous point on massive trucks. We rarely use tents, but this was literally a life or death situation. And to make things worse, the wind picked up and it started to downpour violently. You couldn't even hear yourself talk, it was that chaotic, and if you've ever set up a tent in the wind, you'll know just how impossible it is. By the time that we had everything stacked in, the tent had a few inches of water at the bottom. Our sleeping systems are waterproof, but our entire bodies were soaked to the bone. So they eventually became wet from the outside in, and then the temperature dropped and things got a whole lot worse. Being in the military, you always have to have someone on watch, and since there was still sunlight out, I volunteered to stand it while everyone else hid in their tents. My Gore-Tex rain jacket is completely soaked through, mind you, and honestly, it was the worst day of my life. But finally, I got back inside of my tent and just tried to get some rest. I don't remember falling asleep, but I was suddenly woken up to someone outside asking for help. And it was the same voice of the guy who ended up walking 30 kilometers. Except that guy is still in hospital. He would call out someone's name and say it a few times and then try to get them outside. I think it was my squad leader who just yelled at everyone to stay the fuck in our tents and not go outside. For the next few minutes too, he practically begged us. It kind of sounded like he was in the tree line, maybe 20 meters away. Somehow, he was guessing our names too, and here it was, trying to break us down when we were at our lowest point. It could have gotten right through our tents too, but it seemed to just want to fuck with us or something. Finally, it stopped, and just as I thought, it was gone. I heard it say my name twice, though, in a taunting kind of tone, and then a huge tree just came tumbling down, and that was pretty much it. Traumatized now, everyone stayed in their tents until we heard trucks coming. Over the radio, we were told to pack our tents in less than 30 seconds and get on the trucks. We have no more than 5 minutes. I wasn't going to be the first one to step outside too, so I waited until a good number of people got out. I've never seen a group of people move faster than that too. The tents were stuffed into their bags, the poles bent, the bags were halfway on our bodies. The people practically stumbled into the trucks, in fact. We were told that we were being evacuated due to terrible conditions and that we were heading back to base, but we all knew the real reason. I was relieved to be out of the cold, but we were still on this damn mountain and that thing would still be able to find us. When we got back, we all showered and just got into dry clothes. No one talked and they just went to sleep and tried to understand what had gone down that day. Each and every single one of them realizing, too, that we would likely go back up there in a few days. The next morning after being evacuated, everyone was obviously exhausted and a few guys were sick with pneumonia, too. Being wet, cold, and nearly scared to death just really took a toll. I don't think the incident with the thing outside our tents was talked about in large groups, but it was definitely talked about off on the side. A few guys maintained the fact that it was just a great big prank and kind of laughed it off, but whenever they laughed, it was like they were asking for some form of validation or something. Even in the rear, we were kept busy cleaning weapons and gear and getting ready for whatever is next. Our unit has an unexplainable obsession with training, and it really cut into our morale, but it made time go fast. Life seemed pretty normal despite the weather too, and I stayed indoors at all times unless we were exercising or whatnot. I just didn't have the heart to tell anyone, though, that it was probably watching us from the trees, even if I didn't feel it. The farthest I had ventured was maybe a week after coming down the mountain, though. The base was a small store with an inventory identical to a gas station. I'd gotten tired of what they were feeding us, and my mind had started to rationalize all of my fear away, so I went. Nothing crazy happened, but I did, however, notice that there were people there who were definitely not Marines. These guys were big, burly, and sported full beards too. I pretend to look at the selection of the Doritos and caught a glimpse of a very particular trident tattoo. This meant that whoever this person was, they were Navy SEAL, currently or at some point at least. And I wonder about the other guys too. I approached the bearded guy and simply asked him if he was a SEAL. When he turned around to look at me, he simply looked at me and said, "Yeah, sure, how do you know?" I said, "The tattoo is a dead giveaway. I used to see my college roommate hang all that motivational shit up in his room." "Oh, really?" was all he said. I didn't know what to say, but I wanted to impress him. "Yeah, he's actually a SEAL now." His demeanor got a little friendlier at this point. "Ah, shit. What's his name?" "Kurtz. He's an officer." "Is his first name Walter?" "Yeah, it is. Do you know him?" "Do I know him? He's outside smoking a cigarette." A little info on my friend. We worked a lot together as we both had a sick fascination with pain. Either running, hiking, or swimming, we would torture ourselves nearly every day until he left. I kept up with him as he went through all the training cycles, and then he just disappeared. And I'm talking gone on every fucking form of social media that you can name. I talked to his parents too, and all they got from him was the occasional letter. It always bothered the hell out of me too that he just straight up disappeared from the world without saying a damn thing. I thought about it nearly every day for a long time, and there he was, just outside. and all I wanted to do was get one good punch in. A Navy SEAL or not, he's still a dick for doing that. When we stepped outside and I saw him, I still hated his guts, but I had a feeling that me versus a bunch of SEALs probably wasn't going to work, despite having the power of God and even anime on my side. But he didn't even notice me until I'd said his name. In any other setting, I probably should have saluted him since he was an officer and I was enlisted scum, but I didn't give a shit at this point. But he seemed genuinely happy to see me and wouldn't let go of my hand. We did some catching up, mostly questions from him about my boring life and all that. Whenever I'd ask him about stuff, he would deflect and make a joke or give me a word answer or some shit like that. The man just would not elaborate about what he's been up to. After about 10 minutes of talking, the group of them decided that they were just about done stocking up on Mountain Dew and gummy worms and all that type of trash. But before they headed back, Kurtz pulled me aside though and threw his cigarette to the ground. And with a look of complete concern and worry, he said, "Listen, I don't normally say this, but you shouldn't go back up there, okay? This ain't a place you want to be. You understand?" I wasn't really sure what to say. I just nodded solemnly before he shook my hand and left. And that was the last time that I've been able to talk to him since. One thing to note is that the group of guys, they didn't all have beards or tattoos. Don't get me wrong here, but Navy guys have a certain look, if that makes sense. I can't explain it unless you've been around them long enough, but not everyone in that group was a SEAL. I mean, I even saw a guy wearing an army-related shirt, so I'm assuming that they were some sort of cross-branch team or something. Anyway, I headed back to the concrete hotels and spent some time reading, just trying to get my mind off of what he had said. Some thoughts crossed my mind, like, should I break my ankle or pretend to be sick or something? I mean, they don't have Uber here, and the highway is quite some distance away. Ultimately, I decided that my pride was more important than my life, and I ended up going back into the mountains anyway. And the whole time I was there, I just felt nothing but dread. Here I was being stalked and harassed by something, and on top of that, the Marine Corps is destroying my body every day. I mean, the human body is not designed to hike 175 Ks in a week with 200 pounds of gear on your back, let alone up mountains. However, sometimes you do get a break, and I guess the hikes were relatively short, and all we did was practice our rock climbing skills at night anyway. After about 3 weeks in these mountains, my body too had started to get used to the altitude and the amount of physical activity that we were doing. I was counting down the days in my head every few minutes too, making quick calculations and crunching the numbers on each activity and how much closer I am to safety. But things, they weren't going to be that easy, of course. I had a pretty decent amount of anxiety and dread this entire time, but I rationalized that it was just my mind, and I didn't notice until the third day, when we peaked one of the larger mountains, that we were headed for Devil's Incline again. It had to be a mistake again because the compasses were just acting weird again, right? Well, I talked to a few higher-ups, and sure enough, that was indeed our final destination, because the CO thought that it would be a good challenge or some shit. Great, they're leading us straight to our deaths. The closer we got there too, the worse I felt about this whole thing. I could sleep for no more than 10 minutes because I swear that I could feel it watching me. Not wanting to go crazy, I confided with my squad leader, and all he said was, yeah, I felt it too, but I don't want to talk about it. The next day, we were briefed on our final training exercise. Our job was to assault the peak of the Devil's Incline. The vast majority of it would be climbed using carabiners and rope and just traditional techniques, but the final 500 meters is mostly gravel and can be traversed on foot. We would be provided with overwatch by special forces operating in the area too. It was nothing new. I mean, the military is imaginative and all that. And we were told if we see them, ignore them. So we begin the assault at sunset and get to the middle of the mountain around midnight. Everything is going smooth. We're climbing the cliff slowly and methodically. And in one particular large cliff, I set up one of the anchor points so the Marines can rappel from another side of the cliff. I turn around and head for the next cliff, and before I start climbing, someone angrily asks me why the hell I cut the line and that I could have gotten someone killed. I respond that I didn't cut the line and head back to see what the hell happened. The rope was sliced perfectly, like surgically almost, in fact. If you've ever cut a climbing rope before, you'll know that it's almost impossible to get such a clean cut. You'll always have a tiny bit of fraying, even with the sharpest of knife. This rope, though, it had no fraying whatsoever. All I could assume was that it was that same thing that had been harassing us all month, and trying its best to kill us. Fortunately, there weren't many cliffs after that, and the 500-meter slope of gravel turned out to be way too steep to hike straight up. Also, out of nowhere, a blizzard decided to make our lives hell. To this day, I've never seen such terrible weather, in fact. We're talking 70-mile-per-hour winds, whiteout conditions, everything. It was insane, and on the way up, I swore I was going to freeze to death. And the slope just seemed like it never ended. And after about 3 hours, someone had mentioned that multiple Marines were missing. Our first reaction was to stop and sit there for an hour and then send half of us back in an attempt to find these Marines. And that was the coldest that I'd ever been in my life. At least hiking provided some warmth, but sitting there being buried alive in snow and wind, man, it was bad. I don't know who the hell made the call to just keep pushing forward to the top, but it was the only way anyone was going to survive. There was a road on the other side of the mountain with vehicles most likely waiting for us, and there was no use kicking around anymore for Marines in the snow because things were just getting way worse. I mean, pretty much everyone had some sort of frostbite. We just didn't have the right gear to protect ourselves. But finally, we get to the top, and thankfully, there are tents waiting for us. The tent that I got was broken, so I ended up piling in with a bunch of other guys like a bunch of sardines to keep warm. What a shit show that was, too, setting up in the wind. Anyway, they gave us maybe 20 minutes while they figured out what to do about the missing guys. I'm assuming they called the proper authorities way before that, and it was way too windy for helicopters and nearly impossible for even us to search the area. The wrong gust of wind could literally blow you down the mountain, tumbling face first. Their solution was to first use our thermal optics from the top and search for the guys. But there was nothing. Then we all got on a big line and held hands as we walked down the mountain, and there was nothing. Granted, we didn't bring our 200 pounds of crap with us, so it was a lot easier walking back up. But by now, it was 4 a.m. and it just seemed to be getting worse. They told us to go back to our tents and warm up for 20 minutes because guys were literally turning into zombies at this point. Now, this is quite possibly the weirdest part because for the next 12 hours, no one remembers what the hell happened. Everyone just woke up in their tents and have zero recollection. It was daytime now though, and everyone was just covered in snow. A few of the Special Forces guys, including Kurtz, were talking to all of my higher-ups about something. I didn't find out until later that the SF dudes found all of our missing guys at various locations. Not 30 kilometers far this time, but much shorter distances like 5 or 10 kilometers. Ears bleeding too. And while that's not impossible to hike in a few hours, it's kind of damn hard to get lost on a mountain where your only objective is to go up. But we weren't going to the side or around or down or anything, just up, damn it. We radioed that in though, and the base camp sent special vehicles designed for the snow to get them. They kind of resembled half-tracks. The same day, they loaded us up on the special snow trucks and told us that we're going back to the barracks too. When we got there, we got debriefed on how successful our mission was and some bullshit about accountability of guys and whatnot. In any other situation, they would have lost their jobs if they lost a Marine, but just not in Bridgeport, I guess. We packed up our bags that night and got woken up around 3 a.m. to get on a bus back to the desert. To be honest, I was extremely relieved to go back. But no one ever really talked about our time there again, too. And the guys who disappeared always came back from the hospital saying that they don't remember anything, or they just don't want to talk about it at least. Anyway, I guess that the lesson here is just never go to Bridgeport. After Bridgeport, we were given a pretty decent amount of time off due to various public and military holidays. I spent most of it just sleeping and drinking, as well as indulging myself in the countless luxuries that I'd gone without while I was way up in the mountains. It was nice to finally relax and recover a bit, I must admit. However, good things just don't last long, do they? Pretty soon, we packed our bags, grabbed heavy things, and just headed off into the desert again. We went through a few short but boring field ops that you guys probably wouldn't want to hear about anyway. But this one in particular was in December, and the things had drastically changed weather-wise. It was now winter and the temperature hovered just above freezing, and the wind was the worst part again. You could wear 5 billion layers, and somehow the wind would just cut through all of them and slowly drain the heat out of your body. AKA, it was miserable. The first few days, we did some live fire training exercises. The funnest part was probably when they had me blow up a piece of plywood riddled with nails labeled door to stimulate a breach. Except someone had cut the time fuse on the charge a little too short, and it went off just as I'd gotten behind cover. The riflemen flooded in through the smoke and the dust blindly and cleared the objective of those evil paper targets. It was actually pretty fun. Our next destination after that was a giant ghost town in the middle of the desert. Now get this, it is extremely detailed and built to simulate a real city in the Middle East. And when we got there, it was pretty dark and the streetlights were on, and we quickly grabbed our packs and found a vacant building to set up in. It was pretty creepy because there were paintings on the wall and furniture in every room, and there was even detailed things like an old computer or treadmill with power outlets and all. It was as if they quite literally copy and pasted an entire town out into the desert. Hundreds upon hundreds of buildings and complexes, bazaars, churches, everything. But being out in the wind and given a few hours to sleep, I figured I could get some solid rest in before the training scenario started the next day. But nope. All throughout the night, I was woken up the entire night by a constant banging noise. I figured that the wind had picked up and there was a loose shutter or door somewhere nearby. Great, I thought. I finally had enough though and put in the foam ear protection that we wear when we shoot, and that worked like a dream, and I slept like a log for the rest of the night. The next morning, we started the day just as the sun was coming up, and it was still cold and windy, and I really wasn't excited to eat an MRE, so I drank some water and basked in the early morning sun in a desperate attempt to warm up. Pretty soon, our next task was explained to us. For the next few days, we would build a small base in one of the houses and send patrols out into the city to look for insurgent fighters, played by Marines. There would be civilian actors playing out roles like the mayor, the local religious leader, police chief, and so forth. Then, we were given some annoying laser tag system for our body and our rifle. Our rifles would fire a laser every time we fired a blank round, and if we got shot by another laser too. The laser tag system would start beeping loudly and repeat our status, injured or dead. It all sounded pretty cool actually, and we picked a pretty large 3-story building next to a road and began fortifying our defenses. First, we surrounded the entire perimeter with tons of barbed wire. Then, we blocked off all the exits with sandbags and furniture except for one. There was only one way to get in, and it was right in front of a machine gun that we had set up on the floor above. We blocked all the windows on the 3rd floor and the stairs too, just in case they decided to climb in somehow, even though they weren't allowed to anyway. And it was a well-built defense, and we were proud. I mean, there was no way that anyone would be able to sneak in. During the night, my squad went out to patrol and look for bad guys while one squad slept and one squad defended our compound. And all I can say is that it was super creepy. and exhausting too. We must have walked for 2 hours and maybe halfway through the town or something. When we finally got back from an uneventful patrol, we were told to sleep for a few hours, and sure enough, I started to hear that same damn banging, and this time it was louder. It was like a dull thud on an old iron door or something, slow and methodical, and it never missed a beat. A few of us agreed that we would find out what the hell was making the noise and put an end to it on our next patrol. I put my foam earbuds back in and slept for maybe an hour or two before I was woken up by what sounded like a training grenade going off outside of the building. Great. We were being attacked. It's 2 a.m. and people are shooting at us and throwing fake grenades, and a few people's laser systems are beeping loudly and they are nationally bleeding out. The rest of us are shooting out of windows and calling out targets. The machine gun above is raining hot brass down the stairs, and it was just honestly great fun. The insurgents eventually disappear into the dark, and my squad is sent to pursue them. We checked the surrounding area, but all we found were unarmed civilians. They were pretty great actors too, I'll give it to them. I felt extremely immersed in the situation when they told us that they would only give us information if we gave them guns to protect themselves. And that was not going to happen. On the way back to our base, I made sure we did a quick check for whatever the banging noise that was keeping us up all night was too. We tracked the noise to a building that wasn't very far away from our little base. Maybe 2 houses over, but blocked from our view, I think. And here's the weird thing. All of the windows and doors were covered with sheet metal and bolted shut. When we got close, the banging had stopped, but we all knew that it was coming from that building specifically. Unable to do anything, we went back and posted up on various positions to pull security so that the other squad could rest. I got the short end of the stick and ended up on a window facing the direction of the building. But before I relieved the guy standing there, I asked him if he'd heard the noise from the building, and he nodded and said that he's heard it all night too. I felt like Edgar Allan Poe listening to The Raven, just slowly going mad by myself too. Somewhere in my dreamy stupor, I postulated that somehow one of the insurgents had snuck their way into the building and were pulling some kind of psyops on us by banging away all night. Just as I had passed this up, the banging stopped and I looked like an idiot. Just as I had passed this up, the banging stopped too, and I looked like an idiot. Pretty soon, the sun came up and the rest of the day was pretty uneventful. We set up a few checkpoints and interacted with the locals and gave them water, asked them about the insurgents, etc. A typical roleplay fun. Once the sun had set, we were again harassed by the insurgents, but this time it was less fun because I'd slept maybe 3 or 4 hours in the last few days. It was over in 10 minutes and another squad went out looking for them, and I sat down to try and get a quick nap in, and the banging started right back up again. I was getting pretty damn irritated at this point, so I insisted to head out with a few guys to check the surrounding buildings. The building with the banging had no way of getting in, so I got creative and thought maybe there was a tunnel or something. We went around to each house and kicked all the rugs around like some terrible guests, and boom, we found a hatch. Now, we were told not to enter any of the tunnels because the fans they used for ventilation, they were no longer functional. They told us that we could suffocate, but I didn't really think we would use up all of the oxygen. I mean, it was just a few minutes. So we made the decision to go down. We dropped down and it was absolutely pitch black, so we turned on our flashlights and proceeded forward to the end of the tunnel. As we get closer to the ladder, we heard something similar to the sound you hear when you turn on a really old television. Kind of like a mix between that and when your ears start ringing. And all of the hair on my body stood up on end. There was a slight tinge of fear creeping up on me, but I decided to ignore it and started climbing the ladder. I opened the hatch and immediately began clearing the pitch black room. And nothing. I moved towards the stairs while the rest of the guys flowed in, and at first I thought it was something breathing hard from the exertion, but now I was sure of it. I could hear the faintest whisper of someone saying, "We're in here," coming from upstairs somewhere. We moved tactically up the stairs and began clearing the rooms out, and when we got to the end of the hallway, there was what looked like a kid's room, and I went in, and there was nothing there. And then the batteries on my flashlight started to fade out, which was impossible because I just replaced them today, and they don't drain that fast. I think it was either the corner or the closet, but I heard what sounded like a little girl's laugh, more like a giggle, and I ran straight the hell out of that room and was met with several what the fucks. Someone nervously asked if that was me, and I said no, it wasn't, and I made the executive decision that we were all getting the fuck out of there now. All of us were nearly panicking at this point, but we tried keeping it together long enough to get the hell out of the house. We started to make our way back down the stairs when we heard the laugh again. As we approached the hatch, we noticed that now, of all times, there was tons of furniture stacked on top of it. Desks, wardrobes, couches, even a microwave. But pretty soon, our flashlights all faded slowly out, and we all scrambled towards the pile of shit. The rest of the flashlights, they eventually died out, and everyone panicked and started blindly throwing and shoving things out of the way. The laughing grew louder and more sinister too, like it was coming down the stairs. After what seemed like years, we cleared everything and opened the hatch, and we jumped straight down and scrambled back to the other hatch and through the tunnel. We made it out and pretty much just ran back to our little fort 25 meters away, and all of us were just scared shitless, and it nearly woke everyone up with our stumbling around and cursing. Our lieutenant asked us what the hell had happened, and we told him, and he wasn't really sure whether to believe us or not. His only response was, "Yeah, I've heard some weird stuff about this town." And then he just walked away. We tried to sleep for the next few hours, and I went up to the second floor because I figured that was the safest. I knew that I wasn't going to go to sleep with some creepy stuff going down next door, but it was nice to sit down and relax, I must admit. Around 3 a.m., I heard what sounded like someone running upstairs, loudly. Now, this isn't possible because we had blocked off the stairs to the third floor with desks and couches so that no one would be able to get in from the roof. A few of the guys were woken up too and were sent to go upstairs to clear it out, and there was just absolutely nothing up there. None of the furniture had moved or anything, and, well, I didn't sleep at all that night. In the morning, the townspeople began rioting outside of our compound. It was peaceful at first, but then someone with a backpack detonated an imaginary IED despite our best efforts. As soon as the IED went off, we took fire from pretty much everywhere, and a lot of us were killed. But we were told to go to an aid station all the way across the city to get revived. And I felt like a zombie from the lack of sleep and countless patrols that we'd been on. Once we were revived, we were told that our mission had changed too. We were no longer on the defensive, but we would be clearing out a sector of the town as a part of a larger force. This would be our final event, and then we would be able to go home. We got maybe an hour of sleep before the sun went down and the offensive started. It was pretty easy at first, until we started to take contact from various buildings. We cleared most of them, and I didn't find anyone except for a few open hatches. We sat around and held security while they figured out what to do. Logically, the people in charge of us concluded that the insurgents must have escaped through the tunnels, even though everyone was told not to use them. Cursing, underneath my breath mind you, our squads broke off and I followed my fearless leaders into one of the tunnels. It was pretty simple, but much longer this time. When we got to the very end, we climbed the ladder and tried opening the hatch, but it wouldn't budge. Awesome. We headed back the direction we came, and just as my cynical self predicted, the hatch we had entered with was now stuck too. A few of the stronger guys attempted to muscle it open, but it was like someone had put a huge boulder on top of it. We tried our radios too, but they weren't working, so we resorted to banging on the hatch. And there was nothing. A few of the guys started panicking, but All I wanted to do was to fucking go to sleep, so I sat down and accepted my fate as I reconsidered if I made the right decision in life. I was never claustrophobic, but man, I was starting to feel like I was. The guys were still banging loudly, and I started to try and filter them out, and maybe 5 minutes later, we heard someone banging on the hatch, and we knocked back. They banged again, and someone yelled, "We're in here." We waited for a few seconds for a response, but what we got back still haunts me to this day. It was that same damn little girl laughter that we heard the other night. We all froze because whatever was on the other side started to bang again, slowly and methodically. I felt like I was in a torture cell, and I tried my best to drown the sound out and think about anything else. No one dared to knock again, and it must have been 2 or 3 hours. I don't remember, but it felt like an eternity before we heard footsteps from above. Everyone held their breath and listened, and we heard some furniture being shifted and a few curse words that quickly gave away their identity. Other Marines. Finally. Soon, the hatch was opened, and before we were all even out of the tunnel, we were all getting absolutely chewed out to shreds. Multiple higher-ups were yelling and cursing, and the guys in charge of us were threatened with some punishments, but I personally was pretty relieved to not get yelled at. But from what I heard, they noticed that we weren't part of the assault and assumed that we were put out of the game. They didn't realize until after that they had regrouped and that we were still missing. They got our last known location from one of the other squads who had entered the other tunnels near us and backtracked their way to us. I'm really glad that someone remembered where we were, because a lot of the buildings, they actually had the same damn paint job. Following that incident, it was nearly morning time, and we hung out until trucks came to pick us up and took us back to the base. That was easily one of the more terrifying experiences that I've ever had, because being buried alive scares the hell out of me to this day. Also, just on a side note, for the explosive, time fuses can be kind of tricky to work with. We do a test burn to get an accurate burn rate, but sometimes it doesn't always match. I've gotten a lot of non-creepy related questions about military stuff over the years and in life in general, and I'm still considering whether I should start some kind of blog about all of my experiences, creepy or not. Feel free to leave a comment, guys, if you've got any interest at all. So, I'm going to take a break from my chronological order to briefly talk about something more recent. So I happen to be going to another ghost town, also known as an MOUT town, and this one was much smaller and not that far from the base. There were maybe 8 buildings in total, I think, and they varied from single-story to 3-story buildings. We spent all day hiking to this town, and it was just about late afternoon when we had finally sat our packs down in the buildings. The bone-chilling wind decided to pick up, and the temperatures hovered around freezing as the sun slowly disappeared. We spent the next 5 hours practicing various skills in an urban environment. Clearing rooms, detainee handling, throwing a frag or a grenade, all that type of stuff. It got old pretty fast though, considering that I've been doing this for years now. Around 10 PM, we were given the go-ahead to go indoors away from the wind and get some damn sleep in our warm sleeping bags. I took the first watch because I like to get a good block of sleep in, and after an hour, I woke up the next guy and went to sleep. I was asleep for maybe 30 minutes, I think, before I was woken up with a nudge. I groggily emerged from my bag and noticed that it was one of the newer guys who had just woken up for watch. He had been here for maybe a month or 2, I think, and my first words, understandably, were, "What the fuck do you want, man?" "Well, spit it out." "Well, for the last 10 minutes, I keep seeing these 2 yellow dots across the street, in the window." Okay. "Yeah, well, I was staring at them for a while until I heard what sounded like you to call me over. Except you were in your sleeping bag." Absolutely pissed beyond belief at this point, I put my boots on, grabbed my rifle, and stormed across the street. I went to the open door and it was locked, and these doors don't have locks for safety reasons, so they must have barricaded the door or tied it. I went around the back and tried the other door. Locked. Got it? Whoever was in there was a fucking dick for staring the new guys and waking me up, and man was I pissed. As I walked back across the street, I heard a "Where are you going?" But it definitely wasn't another Marine, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I stopped dead in my tracks. The voice was kind of a mix between a whisper and it carried an icy mocking tone with it. Yeah, fuck that shit. I'm going back indoors, I said. I locked eyes with the guy who woke me up, and we both understood what the hell just went down. I told him to wake up the next guy in a few minutes, and I'm going back to sleep. I got back into my sleeping bag and drifted off to sleep as I tried to burn all of the details into my memory. For you guys, of course. I didn't get woken up until the sun rose, and the wind seemed even fiercer, and it was still ungodly cold, but we were indoors luckily and the sun was rising. It wasn't too bad, I suppose, and pretty soon we got word that we would have to move all of our packs and go about 100 meters from town. A few guys complained and griped, but we did as we were told, and I was equally curious as to why we had to move our packs outdoors. The scuttlebutt was that a few guys, including the commanding officer, had some weird experiences in one of the buildings during the night. All of them refused to sleep in the buildings ever again, and I drifted around while everyone was shaving and eating breakfast to see if I could shed some more light on this sudden exodus from the town. I found one of the guys that were in the building pretty quickly and asked what he had seen. Basically, the night started out with all of the guys huddled around just listening to my stories on YouTube so that they could scare the newer guys. A few hours later, a few of them started having crazy nightmares about being in the town and some creature with cat-like eyes tearing them apart. Except they were the kind of dreams that just never ended. You woke up from one and then you're in another. In other words, they just never knew when they were in the real world or not. The guy on watch tried waking them up, but they just continued to breathe heavily and sob and whimper and fidget. But when they actually did wake up, they were terrified and the message was clear. Get the fuck out of there. I didn't really know what to make of it all, but I told them to quit listening to my damn stories, and not here at least. I'm assuming that this thing was in the building across from mine, but later messed with the other building for God knows what reason. We continued on with our day, and it was packed to the brim with training. During one of our few breaks, I decided to venture to the building that they were all staying in, and I had a few guys come with me just in case, and it was pretty basic. A few chairs, a desk, and a filing cabinet. I saw that there was a rug on the ground too, and kicked it on pure whim, and I laughed when I saw the trapdoor. I opened it and looked down at it, but didn't see anything unusual. The rest of the day was pretty uneventful too. We continued on into the night with our classes and training, and it was all just mostly a blur. I'd gotten back into my sleeping bag, and around 3 a.m, I was woken up for watch and put on just about every warming layer I owned because of the wind. It was a pretty dark night due to all of the clouds hiding the moon, but I could still see the outline of various bushes and shrubs on the skyline. I walked around a bit to keep warm, and I turned my back towards the empty desert, away from the wind, and thought of how nice it would be to get back into my sleeping bag. After about 15 minutes, I turned around out of habit, and I saw a large dark figure on the horizon, maybe 100 meters away. Just as soon as I saw it too, it vanished, and I made a mental note of the location so that I could check it out the next day. I woke up the next guy and got a few hours of sleep before the sun came back up. Unfortunately, I didn't get time to wander off into the desert until around lunch, and I grabbed a buddy of mine and we walked to where I was standing when I saw the thing. From there, we walked about 100 meters, and we were just about ready to head back when we spotted some wood just sticking out a little further away. We kicked a good portion of the sand away and realized that it was another trapdoor. What the hell was a trapdoor doing this far out of town? Our packs were 150 meters from the town, and The trapdoor was another 100 meters out. It just didn't make any sense to have a tunnel entrance 250 meters away. I wasn't ballsy enough to open the thing, but my friend, the mortar man, is a half honey badger and decided to open it just as I was taking a picture. We didn't go down, but he couldn't see the bottom from where we were, and it just looked like an endless ladder. The rest of the day was uneventful, and I didn't have watch that night. And to be clear, we still train in the houses during the day and early night, but we didn't sleep in them anymore. I did hear from another close friend that he would get weird vibes from a few of the buildings when we were still in them during the night. The next day, we messed around with simulation rounds, which are basically 9mm bullets with a wax projectile filled with paint. I didn't get shot, fortunately, but they're about 10 times worse than a paintball from past experiences. Instead of going to sleep that night too, we'd gone back into town to set up a patrol base where some guys would stand post. Some would patrol and some would rest. I swear, Marines, they have amnesia. Anyway, the night started out uneventful, just a few patrols, and we didn't have any enemies, so it was purely just for practice. I slept for maybe an hour and a half, I'd say, and then we stopped off onto another patrol around town. It felt like a waste of my time, but at least we're out of the buildings, right? When we came back, we were approached by a bunch of mortarmen who asked if we would help them find their mortar system. If you don't know what a mortar is, it fires explosive shells out of a cannon into the air. It's not very heavy and can be effective at decent ranges too. Apparently, the guys on the mortar system, they were all asleep with the guy on watch, and he was dutifully standing in the wind, and then he just wasn't. He woke up inside of the house, and the entire mortar system had just vanished. He doesn't remember anything and swears that he didn't just go to sleep to get away from the wind. This was one of my friends who went and checked out the trapdoor with me too, so I trust what he says. Keep in mind, we didn't have any enemy that night, and no one would fuck around and steal shit like that. These things are extremely expensive, and no one would dare mess around with stuff like this. People still doubt him, obviously, but it's strange to say the least. The entire company was woken up at 4 a.m. and we searched everywhere inside of the town, and it was all in vain. Then we expand outwards, and after about 30 minutes of checking the same areas multiple times, I had an idea. I went over to my mortarman friend and told him that we should go back to the trapdoor in the desert that he opened. We grabbed a few of the other mortarmen and told some people that we were going. When we got there, the trapdoor, it was open, despite how bad the wind was too. And well, I sure as hell was not going down there, but the mortarmen were angry and decided to go down just to make sure. I didn't really like the idea at all, but 3 guys went down and it sounded to be about 10 feet. It was pitch black and the flashlights didn't really seem to do much. They were talking amongst themselves for a few seconds as they walked further into the tunnel, and then they were out of earshot. 30 seconds passed and I started to get a little worried. I told myself to wait another 30 seconds before I did anything, and just as I was counting down, I heard what sounded like a little girl laugh again, and then the sound of running footsteps. Pretty soon, I heard the guys climbing up the ladder, and I heard the same laugh again, and this time closer. The first 2 guys had various components of the mortar system, and the last guy had the actual mortar tube, or whatever it is now. It looked like someone had bent it over their knee, and I slammed the door and practically sprinted back to town. But once we got there, we communicated that we'd gotten the damn mortar system back, and the guys that went down had some explaining to do to the officers. I'm sure that they understood, and I went back to sleep for a few more hours until the sun came up and we were woken up for a safety brief. Our last and final day there, we were going to be using blank rounds, smoke grenades and flares, and that was a very busy day. As soon as the sun went down, we all went to sleep, and there was no more training at night in that town, and we all got the message. I didn't have to watch again, but I did hear that a few guys heard this laugh during the night, and one of the guys supposedly got a recording of the laugh on his phone. So I've spent a lot of time in the field without creepy things happening, so I don't think a Marine's life is filled with creepiness. But just recently, I was out there for a few weeks and nothing remotely spooky happened. Anyway, it's April now, spring, and the desert is slowly transitioning from a cold and windy purgatory to a scorching sandbox. Luckily for us, we had hit the jackpot of deployments and headed off to Australia to do some training for 6 months instead of baking in the desert. Now, I know what you're thinking. Australia sounds great, right? I thought that too, until we'd landed in a place called Darwin and stepped off the plane. Instantly, it felt like we were inside of a sauna. It was extremely humid, and we were sweating through our thick uniforms within our first few steps on the tarmac. It was hell, to be honest. There were flies and mosquitoes just everywhere. They would crawl into your mouth and up your nose if you let them, and it seemed like they weren't the only ones with a death wish in this tropical prison. But for the first few months, we did our little dog and pony show to impress the Australian Army. We worked out twice a day and told them all how cool we were, and the food they fed us was always some kind of stew made from yesterday's leftovers. They got old really quick. Being Americans, we quickly found the nearest fast food restaurant and supplier of 2 liters so that we could stock up on calories before the field. We really didn't know what to expect for our first field op. All we knew was that we would head into the thick brush hundreds of kilometers from civilization and expect to be killed by 20 different animals by the first night, if we were lucky. And that's not an exaggeration by any means, too. There's a plant called the Gimpy, aka the suicide plant, because the pain from its sting is so intense and long-lasting that most people and animals just kill themselves. Also, there's a virus in the dirt known as the Vietnam time bomb. Stuff will just kill you from the inside out there. Our first few days out were pretty exhausting too. We did a ton of patrolling at night, or as I like to call it, walking blindly into spider webs. We would try to sleep during the day, but if you slept for more than an hour, you would wake up dazed and dehydrated from the beating sun. I think it was around day 12, towards the end of the field op, when things started to get interesting. We were completely fucking lost, as usual, and wandering around in one long file during the night. There was no moon, and all you could hear were various birds and animals repeat the same noises, just over and over. It was all a blur until the guy in front of me stopped and picked something up. I didn't really pay any mind to it until we had halted for a break and he turned around to me. "Hey man, check this out. I found a doll." "What?" "A fucking doll, dude." He held it up and sure enough, it was a doll. Its body was completely carved out of wood and it had some sort of fake hair or red hair glued on. Its eyes were just burn marks, and it had a creepy little mark scratched across its face. Weird. Keep in mind, we are quite literally in the middle of nowhere. Most of these lands were still completely unexplored too. As I'm sipping water and trying to rack my brain for answers as to why the fuck there's a random doll in the middle of nowhere, we start moving again. I completely forget about the creepy little doll for the next few hours while we mindlessly walked around and tried to find our objective. It was all a blur, and I fell asleep a few times while walking almost, so I don't remember much. Eventually, we found our way and arrived at the objective though, a small clearing in the middle of nowhere. It was the early morning now, and we were supposed to sit there all day and wait for more orders. We were all pretty darn tired at this point, so I sat down and just stared off into the distance and drifted off to sleep. Suddenly, though, I hear a few grunts to my left, and sure enough, the machine gunners are playing with the doll they found. They are a simple-minded breed and easy to maintain, but they always find a way to screw everyone else over. I remember the distinct thought of, yeah, that's probably not a good idea, but I fell back asleep and we spent the day napping and planning for our next objective. But finally, the sun set and we headed off into the distance to our next objective. I remember being kind of excited that we only had one more thing to do and then we would be back to base. As the night went on, our long file of Marines began to get more and more spread out. The brush became thicker and absolutely zero ambient light was coming through. I was struggling to keep up with the guy ahead of me, in fact, and people kept getting lost and we were constantly stopping to find them. We were honestly just trying to get out of the jungle by this point. I was already creeped out by the extreme darkness, but when our compasses and radios and GPS equipment started going crazy, I began to lose some composure. No matter how much we spun our compass or reset our GPSs too, it would always slowly turn us back the way we came. Our radios turned on, but all we could hear was just some kind of white noise. There was nothing really, and I knew right away that it had something to do with that doll. Maybe it was some weird voodoo Aboriginal witchcraft doll. I mean, who knows? Just bad vibes. I told the guy who picked her up to gently just set her down somewhere nice and keep walking. And nothing. Everything was still going haywire. Our leaders decided to take a break to see if they could figure out how to navigate using the stars, and being in the southern hemisphere, the constellations and such are a lot different. While I'm doing my best to keep a cool and level head, I hear the guy in front of me start frantically screaming. I mean, pure fucking terror. A few of the guys walk up to him and calm him down, and he spits out a stream of expletives followed by doll. And the doll somehow made its way back into his backpack. We were too spread out for this to be a practical joke, and it was just too impossible. I mean, we both walked past it when we set it down, and at this point, no one is laughing. He grabs the doll and puts it down, and he starts talking to it and apologizing to it like it was a real human person. I remember making a mental note of just how absurd that was, but by now, our fearless leader seemed to have figured out where to go, so we just start moving. I didn't want to stop because I knew that the doll was probably still with us, but we're talking about lieutenants, and we're bound to just get lost anyway. Eventually, we stop, and all of us are holding our breath while the guy checks his pack. And this time, there was nothing. We sit down and relax, and the air gets a little lighter and easier to breathe. There's a bunch of commotion coming from a few guys back. One of the lieutenants found the doll in their bag this time, and he's completely lost his mind at this point, laughing and crying at the same time, and at day 12 of the field op and all the heat and the bugs and the creepy crap just broke his mind. We put the doll again against some log a few meters away from us, and everyone pauses to assess the situation. We're lost in the middle of nowhere, we have no idea where we're going, and we don't have much water. I can only imagine the smirk on the doll's face while we all collectively start to lose our minds too. But at least the sun is starting to come up, so that's something at least. For the next 30 minutes, we try to confirm our last known location and get a general idea of where we are. But the doll, it isn't done with us just yet. Suddenly, we start to smell smoke, and off in the distant tree line, we see a blazing fire and we pick up. Someone grabs the infective lieutenant, and we head away from the fire into the opposite direction. And sure enough, it's coming from that way too. But we keep trying to find a way out until we realize that we're just walking in circles at this point. Fire everywhere. And in the face of imminent death, we sit down and take cool pictures and hope someone finds them in the aftermath. I was never really a believer in any kind of higher being, and I still don't, but I guess that we just got extremely lucky. We heard a helicopter fly overhead, and I'm assuming they realized that we were lost after we hadn't checked in for a super long time, and the pilot just made an amazing landing between some trees and began ferrying us out into a clearing a few 100 feet away. We made a conscious effort to leave that damn doll behind in the flames too. However, our troubles were not all behind us. Guess what we found when we got back?